Cold plate special. At 2:13 every morning, the old doctor came into Hollow Creek Diner. Nobody knew his name. At least, nobody who worked the night shift knew it. He always arrived alone. Always sat in the booth beside the jukebox. Always ordered black coffee. And always carried the same battered leather case. The diner itself wasn't much to look at. 14 booths. 6 stools at the counter. A kitchen that smelled permanently of grease and onions. A neon sign outside that had lost the letter E years ago, leaving Hollow CRK glowing red through the fog. The hamburgers were cheap. That was what the place was famous for. $2.99 for a double cheeseburger. $3.59 if you wanted fries. The waitress, Mara, had always thought that was strange. Nobody could make a hamburger that cheap anymore. But the cook, Walter, always laughed whenever she mentioned it. Secret recipe, he'd say. Mara never asked what was in it. She wished she had. The night the doctor brought the reels, rain was beating against the windows hard enough to make the glass tremble. Mara was wiping down the counter when the bell above the front door rang. She looked up. The doctor walked in. He was tall and painfully thin, with white hair slicked straight back from his forehead. His suit looked like it belonged to another decade. His hands shook slightly as he carried the leather case. "Evening, doctor." He smiled. "Is it?" Mara frowned. "Is it what?" "Evening." He looked toward the clock. 2:13. Then back at her. "Yes," he whispered. "For now." Mara laughed nervously. "Coffee?" "Please." "Anything to eat?" The doctor's eyes moved toward the kitchen. "No." Then he looked at the menu. "I've already eaten." Mara poured his coffee. He opened the leather case. Inside were 7 reel-to-reel tapes. Each one had a handwritten number. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The handwriting was faded and brown. The final reel was labeled, Patient 431. Mara leaned over the counter. "What are those?" "Evidence." "Of what?" The doctor looked at her. "That we were wrong." "About?" "Everything." He took a small portable reel player from the case and placed it on the table. Mara went back to wiping the counter. She tried not to listen. She failed. The first recording began with static. Then a man's voice. Calm. Educated. Almost bored. Patient 431 continues to insist that he is God. Another voice answered. A woman's voice. Does he still believe he created the universe? A pause. Then the first doctor spoke. No. The tape hissed. He says that's not how it happened. Mara stopped wiping. The patient spoke for the first time. His voice was young. Almost gentle. I didn't create the universe. Static. I remember it. Mara looked toward the old doctor. He didn't move. The tape continued. You misunderstand the difference. The female doctor asked. What do you remember? The patient laughed. You. Mara felt a chill run across her shoulders. The female doctor asked what he meant. The patient answered. I remember you before you were born. The tape clicked. Then stopped. Mara stared. That's creepy. The doctor didn't answer. He rewound the tape. Listen. He played it again. The conversation continued. Tape 2. The patient talked about time. Not traveling through it. Remembering it. He claimed every human being was living only one fraction of their existence at a time. Birth was not the beginning. Death wasn't the end. They were simply moments where consciousness changed direction. Then came tape 3. The patient began describing the hospital. Not the rooms. Not the doctors. The basement. He described a furnace. Kitchen. a meat locker, and hundreds of numbered hooks. Mara's stomach tightened. What hospital was this? The doctor looked at her. St. Jude's Psychiatric Hospital. Never heard of it. It was demolished in 1964. The tape crackled. The patient spoke. They feed us to the town. Mara looked toward the kitchen. Walter was back there. She could hear the rhythmic chopping of a knife. Thump, thump, thump. The doctor noticed her looking. Don't worry. About what? Nothing. The tape continued. The patient laughed. They think they're eating patients. Silence. They're not. Mara leaned closer. The doctor's face had gone pale. The patient whispered. They're eating themselves. The tape stopped. Mara stared at him. What does that mean? The doctor didn't answer. He opened the leather case. There was only one reel left. Number 7. Patient 431. Final interview. I don't think I want to hear that. You do. No. The doctor smiled sadly. You already have. He put the reel on. The machine began turning. Static. Then breathing. The patient's voice. Older now. Much older. If you're hearing this, doctor, you've finally brought her here. Mara's blood ran cold. The doctor slowly looked at her. The patient continued. She's sitting beside you. Mara stepped backward. The doctor didn't move. The patient's voice suddenly changed. It became clearer. Closer. Hello, Mara. She screamed. The real player stopped. But the voice continued. It wasn't coming from the machine anymore. It was coming from the jukebox. The old jukebox flickered. Its glass illuminated. No record was inside. Still, music began playing. A slow, warped version of an old love song. Then the patient's voice came through the speaker. You're wondering why you can't remember your mother singing. Mara froze. The doctor stood. Don't listen. The voice continued. You're wondering why you have no photographs from before you were 12. Mara's breathing became shallow. Stop. You're wondering why Walter always tells you the burgers are made fresh. From the kitchen came the sound of a knife dropping. Silence. Then Walter shouted, Mara! The jukebox laughed. Not the patient. Mara. Her own laugh. A recording of her own voice. She backed away. The doctor grabbed her arm. Run. The kitchen door slowly opened. Walter stood there. His apron was covered in blood. Behind him was the meat grinder. It was running. Empty. For now. Mara stared at him. What is that? Walter smiled. You've been eating it your whole life. The doctor whispered. Don't look in the freezer. Naturally, Mara did. The freezer door was open. Inside were dozens of white plastic bags. Each had a name written on it. Some were old. Some were fresh. One had her name. Mara Vance. Below it was a date. Tomorrow. Mara turned toward the doctor. He was crying. I tried to stop them. Who? He looked at the jukebox. The patients. Mara shook her head. They're dead. The doctor slowly smiled. No. The jukebox spoke. We've never been dead. Every light in the diner went out. The only illumination came from the jukebox. The patient spoke again. Doctor, tell her what happened to St. Jude's. The doctor closed his eyes. It wasn't a hospital. Mara stared at him. It was a kitchen. The jukebox clicked. The patient continued. And the doctors weren't treating the patients. A pause. They were feeding them. Mara looked toward Walter. He was standing perfectly still. Then she noticed something she had never noticed before. His skin. There were stitches around his neck. A thin black line ran from one ear to the other. The doctor whispered. They discovered something in the basement. What? That the human body doesn't contain a soul. Mara's voice trembled. Then what does it contain? The doctor looked at her. Everyone. The jukebox screamed. Every bulb in the diner exploded. And in the darkness, hundreds of voices began speaking at once. Men, women, children, doctors, patients, customers, all whispering the same sentence. We remember you. Then Mara heard another voice, her own, right beside her ear. We remember what you did. She turned. Nobody was there. The jukebox came back on. The patient's voice was calm again. Mara, there's something you haven't remembered yet. She couldn't move. You were patient 431. The doctor shook his head. No. The voice continued. You weren't the patient. The machine clicked. You were the doctor. Mara's memories shattered open. A basement. White tile. Metal tables. People strapped to chairs. A young woman screaming. Walter standing beside a meat grinder. The smell of burning flesh. Her own hands covered in blood. And a man sitting behind a one-way mirror. Patient 431. She remembered him. She remembered asking him, "What are you?" And the patient had smiled. I'm what happens when you remember everything. Mara remembered killing him. She remembered watching his body disappear into the hospital furnace. She remembered going upstairs. She remembered the diner. She remembered being born. She remembered being hired. She remembered every night shift. Every hamburger. Every customer. Every cup of coffee. She remembered doing it for 70 years. But she was 26. She screamed. The doctor grabbed her shoulders. I'm sorry. The jukebox spoke. No, doctor. The doctor's expression changed. The patient's voice became almost affectionate. You aren't sorry. The doctor began to shake. The skin around his mouth split. Something beneath it moved. Not muscle. Not bone. Something pale and wet. Something with too many teeth. Mara stepped backward. The doctor's face opened. And from inside him came the patient's voice. You're hungry. The kitchen lights came on. Walter stood behind the counter. The meat grinder was full. Mara looked down. Human teeth were turning slowly beneath the blades. Walter placed a fresh hamburger on a plate. He slid it toward her. On the house. Mara stared at it. The jukebox began playing an old song. The same song she'd heard as a child. Except she'd never heard it before. The patient whispered, Eat. Mara shook her head. The doctor's body collapsed onto the floor. Something inside it crawled free. A pale, wet thing shaped vaguely like a human infant. It looked at Mara. And smiled. Then the jukebox spoke one final time. You have 7 minutes until the next customer arrives. Mara looked at the clock. 2:13. It hadn't moved. She looked toward the windows. There was no road outside anymore. No parking lot. No gas station. No town. Only darkness. And hundreds of people standing beyond the glass. All staring at her. All wearing hospital gowns. All with their mouths sewn shut. Except one. Patient 431. He stood directly in front of the window. He raised one finger. And slowly wrote something in the condensation. Your shift is almost over. Mara stared. Then the letters changed. Your life is almost over. Then, your next life has already started. Behind her, Walter switched on the meat grinder. Mara turned. He smiled. Don't worry. He lifted the hamburger from the grill. It's not you we're cooking. The jukebox crackled. The patient's voice whispered, Not yet. And somewhere beneath the diner, something enormous began to wake up. Chapter 2. Hollow Creek. By morning, Mara had convinced herself that she had dreamed it. That was the only explanation that made sense. People didn't crawl out of dead doctors. Jukeboxes didn't speak. Freezers didn't contain bags with tomorrow's date. And diners didn't disappear from the outside world. So when the sun came up, Mara stood behind the counter with a cup of coffee in her hand and watched the first automobiles roll down Main Street. Everything looked normal. Almost. Hollow Creek was a small town tucked between two ridges in the Appalachian foothills. In 1957, there were just over 3,000 people living there. At least, that's what the census said. The town had one movie theater, one grocery store, one barber shop, two churches, a funeral home, a gas station, a hardware store, a newspaper office, and Hollow Creek Diner. There was also the Hill. Nobody called it anything else. The Hill. It rose behind the eastern edge of town, covered in dark pine trees. At the very top stood an enormous black church. Mara had noticed it before, but she'd never really looked at it. Nobody did. The building seemed too large for Hollow Creek. Its walls were made from black stone. Its windows were narrow and impossibly tall. And there was no sign above the door. No denomination. No name. Nothing. The church had supposedly been built before the town existed. Nobody could agree on when. Some said 1883. Others claimed 1911. The oldest people in town insisted it had always been there. Mara had never seen anyone enter it. She had never seen anyone leave. Yet every Sunday morning the parking lot was full. That was the first strange thing about Hollow Creek. The second was the people. They smiled too much. Not happy smiles. Polite smiles. Practiced smiles. The kind of smile people gave when they had been told exactly what expression to wear. Mr. Bell, the barber, always smiled. Mrs. Whitcomb at the grocery store smiled. The postman smiled. Even children smiled. And none of them ever seemed surprised by anything. Car accident? Smile. A funeral? Smile. A house burning? Smile. A man disappearing? Smile. Mara had once asked Walter about it. "Folks here are friendly," he'd said. "They're strange." Walter had looked at her for several seconds. Then he'd smiled. "You'll get used to it." That morning, Mara noticed something else. Nobody was talking about the previous night's events. Not the doctor. Not the screaming. Not the power outage. Not the body. Nothing. She walked into the kitchen. Walter was already preparing hamburgers. The grill hissed. "Morning." He didn't look up. "Morning." "Where's the doctor?" Walter paused. Then he turned. "What doctor?" Mara stared at him. "The old man." "What old man?" "The man who came in every night." Walter smiled. "You've been working too hard." Mara felt cold. "I've been here 3 months." Walter nodded. "Exactly." Then he turned back toward the grill. Mara watched him. There was something underneath the smell of cooking meat. Something sweet. Metallic. Almost like blood. She walked toward the freezer. Walter's voice stopped her. "Don't." She turned. He was still facing the grill. "Don't what?" "Open it." "Why?" Walter smiled. "Health department." She laughed despite herself. But Walter didn't. He simply kept cooking. Outside, the town continued its morning routine. The milkman drove past. Children walked toward school. A woman hung laundry from a clothesline. A newspaper boy stood on the corner shouting, "Extra! Extra!" Mara stepped outside. "What's the headline?" The boy looked at her. His smile disappeared. He held out the newspaper. The front page read, "Local doctor found dead." Mara's stomach dropped. She looked at the date. June 14th, 1957. Then she looked at the photograph. It was the old doctor. But beneath the photograph was another line. Dr. Elias Vale, 1891 to 1957. Mara stared. The newspaper boy whispered, "He died 32 years ago." Then he smiled and ran away. Chapter 3. The People of Hollow Creek. Mara began asking questions. That was her first mistake. The second was asking them in public. She started at the newspaper office. The Hollow Creek Gazette occupied a narrow brick building beside the courthouse. Inside, an enormous printing press rattled beneath hanging lamps. The air smelled of ink, tobacco, and hot metal. An elderly man named Amos Reed sat behind a desk. He wore suspenders and round spectacles. Mara placed the newspaper in front of him. "Who's Elias Vale?" Amos didn't look at the photograph. "I don't know." "You printed this, didn't I?" "You said he died 32 years ago." "That's right." "Then why did he come into the diner last night?" Amos finally looked at her. The room became very quiet. The printing press continued pounding. Thump, thump, thump. Amos leaned toward her. "Did he bring the reels?" Mara froze. "You know about those?" Amos removed his glasses. "Miss, everybody knows about the reels." "Who was patient 431? Amos stared at her. Then he whispered, "You shouldn't say that number." "Why?" "Because things hear numbers." Mara laughed. Amos didn't. He opened a drawer. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings, all from different decades. 1932, 1933, 1934, 1935, 1936, 1937. Mara picked one up. The headline read, "Patient escapes St. Jude's." Another. 3 doctors missing. Another. Local family found dead. Another. Hollow Creek man claims God speaks through jukebox. Mara looked at Amos. "What's going on here?" He leaned back. "You really don't remember?" "Remember what?" He pointed toward her. "You were here before." Mara shook her head. "I've never lived anywhere but." She stopped. Something flashed through her mind. A little girl. Running through an apple orchard. A woman screaming. A black church on a hill. Typewriter. Then it vanished. Mara grabbed the desk. Amos watched her. "There it is." "What?" "The memory." "That wasn't a memory." "Yes, it was." "I've never been here." Amos smiled sadly. "Nobody in Hollow Creek has." Mara stared at him. He lowered his voice. "This town doesn't have a history." "What?" "It has repetitions." The printing press suddenly stopped. Silence. Then the machines began again. Thump, thump, thump. Amos looked toward the ceiling. "You should leave town." Mara nodded. "That's what I'm going to do." He shook his head. "No." She frowned. "Why not?" "Because if Hollow Creek wants you to leave, you'll leave. And if it doesn't?" Amos put his glasses back on. "You'll discover why." That afternoon, Mara walked through town. She noticed things she'd never noticed before. The same black Chevrolet was parked outside the grocery store. The same woman stood behind the window. The same little boy rode the same bicycle around the courthouse. She watched him pass. 5 minutes later, he passed again. Same bicycle. Same clothes. Same smile. She followed him. He turned the corner. Mara hurried after him. Nobody was there. Only an empty street. At the corner stood a payphone. It rang. Mara stared at it. The bell rang again. She picked up. "Hello." Static. Then breathing. A man's voice whispered, "You're late." "Who is this?" "You've been gone a long time." Where? The voice laughed. From yourself. The line went dead. Mara slowly hung up. Across the street, the black church stood above the town. For the first time, she noticed smoke rising from its chimney. She watched it. The smoke was black. Not gray. Not dark. Black. Like ink. Chapter 4. The church on the hill. Nobody went to the church after dark. That was one of Hollow Creek's unwritten rules. There were others. Never whistle after midnight. Never answer the third knock. Never look into the mirrors at the diner after 3 a.m. Never ask Walter where the meat comes from. And never climb the hill. Mara learned about the last rule from Mrs. Whitcomb. The old woman was buying canned peaches when Mara asked about the church. Mrs. Whitcomb dropped the can. It struck the floor. Neither woman moved. Don't talk about that. Why? Because it hears. Mara glanced toward the ceiling. It's a building. Mrs. Whitcomb's face tightened. No. What is it? The old woman leaned closer. The church isn't where it is. Mara didn't understand. Mrs. Whitcomb whispered, "That's the problem." Then she walked away. That night Mara couldn't sleep. At 2 a.m., she heard something outside her apartment. Typewriter. Click. 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 The sound continued. Slowly. Deliberately. She opened her window. Nothing. The street was empty. Click. 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 She looked toward the hill. The black church was illuminated. Every window glowed yellow, and someone was typing inside. Mara grabbed her coat. She didn't know why. Perhaps she already knew. She walked toward the hill. The streets of Hollow Creek were completely empty. No automobiles. No porch lights. No dogs barking. Nothing. As she reached the base of the hill, she saw something carved into a wooden sign. Turn back. Below it someone had scratched another message. She didn't. Mara stared. The typewriter continued. Click. 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 She climbed. Halfway up, she heard voices. Children laughing. Then crying. Then laughing again. She looked back. Hollow Creek was spread beneath her. Every house was dark, except the diner. Its neon sign flickered. Hollow CRK. The jukebox inside switched on by itself. Even from the hill, Mara could hear it. Then she heard another sound. A telephone ringing. Then another. And another. Every house in town began ringing. Mara turned toward the church. The massive black doors were open. Inside was darkness. Then the typewriter stopped. A man's voice came from inside. Come in, Mara. She froze. It was the patient. Patient 431. Except there was something different about his voice now. He sounded frightened. Mara. She took another step. Please. Another step. Before they finish writing you. She reached the doorway. Inside stood a long corridor. At the end was a desk. On the desk sat an old black typewriter. The keys were moving by themselves. Click. 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 A sheet of paper slowly emerged. Mara walked toward it. The typewriter stopped. She picked up the page. There was one sentence. Mara Vance arrived at the church at 2:13 a.m. She looked at the clock. 2:13. Another line appeared. Mara Vance read the page. The keys moved again. Click. 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 Mara Vance began to understand. She dropped the paper. The typewriter continued. A new line appeared. Mara Vance will open the basement door. Mara backed away. No. The typewriter continued. Mara Vance will open the basement door. No. The keys slammed down harder. Mara Vance will open the basement door. She turned and ran. The doors slammed shut. The church went dark. Then came a sound from beneath the floor. Something enormous scratched against the wood. Once. Twice. 3 times. Mara stood frozen. Then a voice whispered from beneath her feet. Not the patient's. Not the doctor's. Her own. I'm still down here. The floorboards began to split. And somewhere deep beneath the black church, a typewriter began typing again. Click. 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 As though something beneath the earth had just begun writing the next chapter.